Have you ever been on a podcast where the conversation just seemed to not ever work out? There never seemed like a good way for there to get out of that interrogation. You simply were asked a question, you answered it, and you got asked another question, and you answered it. Well, in today's video, I want to talk to you a little bit about how to be more conversational, both from a host and from a guest perspective. What's up, guys? This is Philip Sessions, your public speaking coach, here to help you with all things public speaking. And today we're going to get into the podcast side of things. Let's go ahead and start with the host first. If you want to be conversational, you need to ask great questions. And so what I like to do when it comes to my podcast is, of course, ask a great question or just ask a question in general. It doesn't necessarily have to be great. That first question, but that follow-up question needs to be great. So there's two approaches that I take to asking questions. I'll, of course, ask a question based on my podcast, what I want people to learn from the guests that I have on, if they're an expert or if they're just somebody that's been doing that work, and I want to share what they've been doing and using speaking to help them grow their business and grow themselves and their personal brand. So I'll go in and I'll ask a specific question. They'll go ahead and answer that. Some elaborate more than others. And the more they elaborate, the better it is. So that usually means a more experienced guest. So this will really help you with both the experienced and unexperienced guest, because what you do from there is one of two things. The first thing that I like to do, and this is always something that I do pretty much every single time, is they'll go on and they'll say a bunch of things, or maybe they'll say a couple of things. And I pick like one thing. I pick this one little thing and I elaborate on that. Usually it's something that's kind of caught my attention. And so I will regurgitate, I'll elaborate upon it. I will summarize what they said first, and then I'll go in and elaborate upon it. And then I may even throw in a little bit about me, something personal about me that relates with that. And then if it's interesting enough, or I want to talk more in depth about it because I felt like they didn't really go into too much detail, I'll actually ask more questions. So sometimes I'll actually throw out that first part and just go in and ask another question, and what I like to call a rabbit hole. So we go in, I ask a question, go down this rabbit hole, and I come back out and then go to the next question, go back down the rabbit hole, and just keep rinsing and repeating until we finish a podcast that's anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour long podcast, where I asked essentially maybe 5 or 6 main questions, and I asked them sub questions based on those questions and how they answered those questions. And that's what really creates that conversation from the host side, is that you elaborate upon that. You don't go into detail, and you definitely don't go and answer your own question. I'll say 99% of the time. I don't like to say 100%. I don't like to have absolutes. But people are there and they're expecting to hear from your guest more than from you. So you don't want to go in and answer the question yourself, because most likely as well, you've already answered it and it just becomes monotonous and people just hear the same answer from you every single episode. So they're going to stop listening. So make sure that you just expand upon what they said, and or you go in and ask them another sub question with that question to get them to dig a little deeper, dive a little bit deeper, and give more information based on that answer they gave, because it's some interesting stuff. And so it doesn't happen every time, but it's something you can do to help you with that conversation and be a little bit more conversational within your podcast. Then the other side is being the guest. So if your host is a great host, that is going to be one like I just talked about, where they'll ask you a question, they'll dive a little deeper, they'll go in and elaborate, where you can kind of get that back and forth banter instead of being question, you answer, another question, you answer, another question, you answer. And it feels like an interrogation. And it feels that way, not just to you as the guest, but it also feels that way to the audience. So what you can do is ask a question back, especially when you have a host like that. You turn the question around on them. You ask them their thoughts on that, because more than likely all of their episodes are going to be like that, where they just ask a question, you give an answer, and they go on to the next thing. So you ask their thoughts, and that helps create some dialogue, that helps create that conversational piece within there as well. And so you asking that question creates a conversation piece, and you can then go back and then you can add something to it. So it's almost like you become a co-host of this podcast, but you help the host out and help yourself out as well, because more people are going to be engaged with that conversation, because now it's a conversation rather than just a literal interview. And I know most podcasts are interview based, but where you go and ask that question, ask their thoughts, and you elaborate on what they said as well, and then give your 2 cents on what you think, and you kind of keep doing that over and over as they ask more questions. It's going to help create that conversation. The other thing that you can do is when they do ask you a question, and whether they're a good host or a bad host, they'll be able to, if they're a good host, they'll be able to help figure out and elaborate a little bit more on this. But if they're a bad host, they're not going to. And it's going to be super quick, and it's going to be super awkward, most likely, of a conversation, of an interview. But go in and elaborate on the question, especially if you know who the audience is, if you know who they're trying to reach and what the audience is supposed to learn from you, why you're there. You can go ahead and elaborate more on the question. So we'll, for example, say, hey, what's your favorite book? And you can just say, and I've got $100 million offers on my mind right now. And so you say, oh, $100 million offers is my go-to book right now. That's the book I really enjoy and I've learned a lot from. And you just sit there awkwardly. And the guest's like, okay, cool. And they just go on the next thing. Well, a good guest would then say, oh, yeah, Alex is great. I love $100 million offers. I learned so much from it, or I've read it several times, or I had this takeaway from the book. What has been the most beneficial thing you found from that book? As the host, you go back and ask the guest that question. So you bring that out as a host, and I'm not going to host, but as the guest, don't just sit there and say, yeah, $100 million offers. That's the book I like and the book I'm into right now, and just be done. Go in and elaborate about it. Like I just said with the host asking those questions, you could say that, oh, yeah, there's this one part in there where he talks about building your offer stack and making sure, and I'm making some of this up, that it's 10 times the value and everything. That's what's really going to help people want to buy from you. And I learned why people aren't buying from me based on the fact that my offer is not strong enough. It's not that my service isn't great enough. It's just that my offer isn't strong enough for them to want to buy from me. And so you really elaborate on that, and then hopefully the host picks up from there and actually says something else. But if not, you go back to what I mentioned a minute ago, and you go and ask them a question like, hey, have you read that book before? Have you heard of Alex Hormozy? You can go and ask those questions. But as that guest, you want to make sure you elaborate on questions, and you go in and ask the host questions that help bring out a conversational piece within that podcast. So long story short, if you decided to skip forward, or if you don't want to go back and listen to everything, I suggest that you do, so you can understand a little bit more of the nuances of why you want to have these conversations within your podcast. But if you don't want to go back and listen, essentially go and ask more questions and elaborate on your answer, or go into rabbit holes within. So dig deeper into those questions. So ask a question and then ask a follow-up question to that question in order to be able to dig deeper and get more elaboration on each individual question. And this is what will create those conversations within your podcast.